So I'm very pleased to be addressing you today on the subject, on the three figures that were sent to some of you in my abstract: Philippa Foot, Iris Murdoch, and Bernard Williams. This is partly so for autobiographical reasons. Many years before I had any notion of philosophy as an academic discipline, I discovered in the fiction of Iris Murdoch the ideas that have sustained me, ethically and intellectually, ever since. Nothing has persuaded more of the reality of what is sometimes called moral luck than the fact that it was Murdoch's novel, The Bell, that I, aged 17, picked up off the shelves of the local British Council library, and not, as it might so easily have been, The Fountainhead. A few years after that, I was studying philosophy in the place where Murdoch and Foot and Williams had lived and studied and taught for large parts of their lives. And it was in my first few months in Oxford that I first read some of the books that I shall be talking about today. Richard Hare's The Language of Morals and Freedom and Reason, the essays in Philippa Foot's Virtues and Vices, and in Murdoch's The Sovereignty of Good, and Bernard Williams's Morality, an Introduction to Ethics. Williams's little book was written in an age when it was thought better sense to publish small books on big things than what we now mostly write, namely big books on small things. And it was in the opening pages of this book that I first encountered the figure who is my subject today, the Amoralist. The Amoralist, as Williams conceived of him, is someone who asks that old question, why should I do anything? And in his mouth, the question is not a cry of despair, but a shout of defiance. And what is being defied is morality. Why should I do what I'm supposed morally to do? Have I any reason to constrain the pursuit of my own interests in recognition of the interests of other people? Isn't morality, in other words, simply another name for being a mug? This Amoralist is, of course, a philosopher's fiction, but a fiction devised for a purpose. As Williams put it, the thing about the Amoralist is that he is not an irrationalist. And I quote, he, after all, acknowledges some reasons for doing things. That is to say, reasons grounded in his own interests, if not those of anyone else. He is, in his purest and most extreme form, a strange creature only a philosopher could think up. But his inclinations, his resentments, his defiance are only too human. And to quote Williams, he is like most of us, some of the time. The point of this grotesque construction is to set ourselves a philosophical challenge. As Williams has it, and this is the first text on your handout, if morality can be got off the ground rationally, then we ought to be able to get it off the ground in an argument against him. While in his pure form he may not be actually persuaded, it might seem a comfort to morality if there were reasons which, if he were rational, would persuade him. Unquote. You will see that the second quotation on your handout has another possible way in which this figure can be described in the words of Philippa Foot. So an amoralist is someone, says Foot, who will agree that a moral man has moral ends and cannot be indifferent to matters such as suffering and injustice. He will not, however, take the fact that he ought to have certain ends as in itself reason to adopt them. If he is an amoral man, he may deny that he has any reason to trouble his head over this or any other moral demand. And where moral here is being understood specifically as altruistic, a recognition of the interests and claims of other people than oneself. What I'll be trying to provide you with today isn't a solution to the old problem of the amoralist. I happen to think, to cut ahead slightly to my conclusion, I happen to think that the problem as narrowly conceived has no solution. I'm among those who think that no reasons might exist to persuade someone who's not already in the world of morality to step into it. But if Williams is right about this, then that deprives us who are in that world, in the world of morality, in the world where we acknowledge the claims of others. It deprives us of the comfort of thinking that our way of life, with all its inconvenience and resentments, it deprives us of the comfort of thinking that that life is not only permitted, but also demanded by reason. And this raises further questions. Why did we seek the imprimatur of reason in the first place? And what shall we do now that we know that we do not have it? A throwaway remark of Iris Murdoch's comes to mind. This is text number 3 on your handout. I quote, "It is always a significant question to ask of any philosopher, what is he afraid of?" The point stands when it is asked not of just one philosopher, but of a whole philosophical tradition. What are they, or we, afraid of? Now, the problem goes back in the tradition of Western philosophy to the challenge made to Socrates in the first 2 books of Plato's Republic. Why be just? Why be just if no one knows it? Is justice, in fact, a second best to the real prize, a life of injustice with impunity? Now, Plato's term, dikaios euner, generally translated as justice, is the conceptual ancestor of our word, morality. And the figures in Plato's corpus of the what we may call Amoralists, Callicles and Thrasymachus, they're the flesh and blood fictions that bequeath to 20th century philosophy our more abstracted, etiolated figure of the Amoralist that I have just described. Now, the question raised by the Amoralist, the why be just question, is a good one, was a good one when Plato asked it, and it remains a good one. And what lies behind it is a fear, an anxiety, perhaps sheer terror that reason and truth and beauty and goodness will not in the end converge. Philosophers, such as the ones I've mentioned, philosophers writing in the decades after the Second World War, could hardly be complacent about these questions. The final solution had the air of the special kind of madness that comes not with too little, but too much rationality, or perhaps too much rationality of the wrong sort, the rationality that consists only in the ruthless pursuit of the most efficient means to predetermined ends. And if those ends are not themselves up for rational discussion, then it's hard to see how we can avoid at least the logical possibility of the amoralist. Given certain narrowly egoistic ends, simply stipulating them, it may be possible to argue the amoralist into some indirect and instrumental consideration of the interests of others. To the amoralist, moral virtue can have its rewards, but no amoralist can think of virtue as its own reward. Nor can the amoralist be given reason to distinguish between real virtue and a convincing simulacrum. And there is no guarantee grounded in logic, certainly, that life and the world won't throw up circumstances in which it is vice that has all the rewards. And to a philosopher of a certain temperament, the logical possibility of such a figure, the absence of a logical guarantee of his non-existence, that can be frightening enough. Now, the 20th century intellectual tradition is hardly starved of critiques of this idea of rationality. The rejection of what is called instrumental rationality is central, for example, to a great deal of mid-century Marxist thought. Now, the figures I'm talking about today, Foote and Murdoch, for instance, were not, at least didn't stay, in Murdoch's case, didn't for very long stay Marxists. And the ways in which they rejected it owed much less to Marx than to Aristotle, in Philippa Foote's case, as filtered through certain ideas of Wittgenstein, and in Murdoch, the big influence was Plato, as interpreted in her somewhat idiosyncratic way. In both philosophers, the category of reason ended up being transformed into something that was not separate from, and indeed, or for that matter, more fundamental than morality. Rather, it was replaced with this larger category, where reason and morality could be seen as aspects of the same larger picture. But to say all this is to get ahead of ourselves. My interest is in the early work of Foote, Murdoch and Williams, and even within the tradition of instrumental rationality, which they, at least for argumentative purposes, were willing to concede to their opponents, they found considerations that might allay our anxieties about the amoralist somewhat. And they did so with an unusual imagination, psychological perceptiveness, and awareness of difficulty. Two personal contrasts might serve to explain what I mean. The first of these is A.J., or Freddie, as he liked to be called, Eyre, a philosopher of enormous quickness and personal charm. And it can seem sometimes that he simply waltzed into the history of 20th century philosophy like a gunslinger in an American Western. So this is text number 5 on your handout, and I quote, The traditional disputes of philosophers are, for the most part, as unwarranted as they are unfruitful. Thus begins his short 1936 book, Language, Truth and Logic. One such traditional dispute was over the nature of value and whether it is to be found in the world of nature, the world as studied by the natural scientist. Eyre thought that the answer to that question was to be found in some suitably updated version of the philosophy of the Scottish Enlightenment with Viennese bells and whistles attached. David Hume as seen through the cutting-edge lenses of the logical positivists of Vienna. The only world in this worldview was the world of the scientists. Everything else was, statements about everything else were, in the strict sense, nonsense. Values, then, were only in the world because we put them there. Or to speak more precisely, it was a mistake to think of our language of value, moral value, aesthetic value, religious value, as if it were describing some feature of the world outside of us. Our language simply evinced our value, our attitudes, right? Evinced being a favourite term of this generation. Our language was, in other words, not descriptive, but expressive. And there was supposed to be something liberating about this. As Eyre put it in a different connection, I quote, "Logically, our freedom is unlimited," unquote. Our moral language wasn't constrained, ultimately, by the world. And this, he thought, might be a kind of liberation. Now, the language of freedom is also part of at least the rhetoric of another philosopher, born in 1919, the same year as Murdoch, Anscombe and Midgley. Foote, I think, was born a year later, 1920. And this philosopher was Richard Mervyn Hare. Now, Hare was a serious man, he was an earnest man, and nothing in his first book, The Language of Morals, published in 1952, expresses the sort of reductive glee to be found in Language, Truth and Logic. And this is no surprise. Hare had had a harrowing war, and after experiences like his, no one could be simply glib. Hare had spent the larger part of the war in Japanese prison camps in Singapore and Thailand. In these camps, and this is text number 6 on your handout, now these are remarks from a New Yorker profile of him from the early 60s by a journalist called Ved Mehta, who later published them as a book called Fly in the Fly Bottle, which I commend to you. These were the days when the New Yorker regularly thought it worth sending a journalist to Oxford to cover philosophical controversies. So, in the prison camp, Hare had come to some grim conclusions. I quote, "All values had to be hewn from the rock of his own conscience. In the artificial community of the prison, he, that is to say Hare, came to realize that nothing was given in society, that everyone carried his moral luggage in his head. Every man was born with his conscience, and this, rather than anything in society, he found was the source of morality. As he once wrote, to quote Hare directly, a prisoner of war community is a society which has to be formed and constantly reformed out of nothing. The social values, whether military or civil, which one has brought with one, can seldom be applied without scrutiny to this very strange, constantly disintegrating situation," unquote. Indeed, to continue with Mehta's commentary, the rough draft of his first book, The Language of Morals, was hammered out in the grim and barren prison compounds. Now, after this experience, we shouldn't be surprised that Hare was unattracted to a picture of morality as involving not much more than expressions of approval and disapproval. As the old caricature has it, this was a view in which a statement like "torture is wrong" really amounts to no more than "boo torture." But there was something in the positivist picture that Hare wanted to keep, namely its suggestion that values were chosen against a backdrop of logical constraints, but chosen nevertheless, not discovered. We might, of course, want to argue this point for any number of reasons. Hare seemed to think that there was something about the conditions of the prison camp, its being somehow outside society, maybe even outside history, something about the conditions there that exposed in their starkest and least consoling form deep truths about human nature and life. But why think that? As his student, Bernard Williams would say, though not addressing Hare directly, and this is text number 7 on your handout, I quote, "Conditions of great stress and deprivation are not the conditions for observing the typical behavior of any animal, nor for observing other characteristics of human beings. If someone says that if you want to see what men are really like, see them after they've been 3 weeks in a lifeboat, it is unclear why that is any better a maxim with regard to their motivations than it is with regard to their physical condition. Unquote. Why, in other words, think that the deep truths about human beings are to be found outside society in extremis, rather than what are usually thought the normal conditions of human life? But let's leave that point aside for the moment. The case was, of course, argued by Hare with his usual ingenuity, care, rigour and precision. But what is clear, despite the fact that the presentation of the view is one that doesn't bring with it any explicit moral worldview, it does seem to me to be clear that Hare's claims about the logic of moral language were at least somewhat motivated by a moral ideal. Commenting in a BBC broadcast in the 50s on the notorious claims made by people tried in the 1950s for war crimes that they had only been, in that famous phrase, following orders, he said, and I quote, "There is a point beyond which we cannot get rid of our own moral responsibilities by laying them on the shoulders of a superior, whether he be general, priest, or politician, human or divine." Unquote. There is an unpublished paper of his to be found in the archives of Balliol College, where he'd been a fellow for the entirety of his career. And in this paper, he imagines himself back in the prison camp as an interpreter and trying to persuade a commander in the prison camp that he should not send the sick and weak out to work on the railway, the death railway from Siam. I quote here, this is text number 8. I ask him, i.e. the commander, I ask him to visualize not certain non-natural properties, but the very natural, real properties of the situations that the alternative courses of action will bring about. It is not by any appeal to intuition that I can conduct my argument. It is by revealing to him the nature of his choice and showing him what it involves, what in fact he is choosing. And when I have done all this, I can only leave him to choose, for it is, after all, his choice, not mine. At any rate, I have myself chosen, so far as in me lies, my own way of life, my own standard of values, my own principle of choice. In the end, we all have to choose for ourselves, and no one can do it for anyone else. Now, as he remarked elsewhere, and this is text number 9, a quotation from Freedom and the Will, it is sufficient that men in the world being what they are, we can be very sure that hardly anybody is going to take such steps as the one, for instance, contemplated by that commander. Hardly anybody is going to take such steps with his eyes open. And when we're arguing with one of the vast majority who are not going to take it, the reply that somebody else might take it does not help his case against us. In this respect, all moral arguments are ad hominem. Right? And by ad hominem, he, of course, means it in its strict sense, directed at the person, not in the sense of a kind of logical fallacy. Now, there was not much more than a difference of language, I think, between this strand in Hare's thought and that of, say, Jean-Paul Sartre in France. Existence precedes essence, as he nominally remarked. Man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself. Now, the figures that haunted Hare's philosophy were those of the Amoralist, whom we've already encountered, and a sort of variant, someone Hare calls the fanatic. The fanatic was someone who met Hare's every logical test for a moral principle, chiefly that it can be universalized. It's subject to the test of what if everyone acted on it. But this is someone whose principles do manage to meet those logical tests, but nevertheless ends up with a worldview that, to those who don't share it, is simply repugnant. Logic by itself couldn't stop, say, a fanatical Nazi from thinking that to be Jewish was to deserve death. It couldn't stop him from persisting in this belief, even after being invited to consider that it was the merest accident of birth that made him a German and Gentile and not a Jew. I direct you to text number 10, where Hare says, "It is possible for a man to come sincerely to hold an ideal which requires that he himself should be sent to a gas chamber if a Jew." But Hare didn't take this to be a reductio ad absurdum of the position that had led him to this conclusion. On the contrary, Hare said, and I quote, "That is the price we have to pay for our freedom." Freedom, choice, decision, the will, These were the words that gave to what presented itself as a detached theory of what morality simply is, its characteristic mood, its moral mood of earnestness and tough-mindedness. What this picture had little room for was an alternative picture of morality as vision, morality as perception, morality as intellectual apprehension, morality as submission. And whatever its attractions, it was, and was probably meant to be, revisionary, at a remove from the view from the upper deck of the proverbial Clapham omnibus. As Iris Murdoch, for one, put it, and this is text number 11, the ordinary person does not, unless corrupted by philosophy, believe that he creates values by his choices. He thinks that some things really are better than others, and that he is capable of getting it wrong, unquote. And Williams, in a similar vein, thought that Hare and others who shared his view should be more aware of just how revisionary their picture of moral thought really was. And I quote, this is text number 12, "When we see that many philosophers represent the responsibilities of morality in terms of our deciding on certain moral principles, then we have reason to be dissatisfied, either with them or, if they're right, with moral thought. For certainly the consciousness of a principle of action as freely decided upon is very unlike the consciousness of a moral principle, which is rather of something that has to be acknowledged. If it is then said that there is just a psychological explanation of that, then moral thought seems a cheat, presenting itself to us too like something which it is not." Philippa Foot was one of those in that generation of philosophers who felt the same anxiety about morality, as being not so much vindicated by views such as Hare's, but rather being exposed as fraudulent. "It is often felt," she said, and this is text number 13, "it is often felt, even if obscurely, that there is an element of deception in the official line about morality, and while some have been persuaded by talk about the authority of the moral law, others have turned away with a sense of distrust," unquote. So one can be a voluntarist about morality, one can think it is all about the will and freedom and choice and decision, but that view of it won't leave everything where it was before. In an interview she gave much later in her life, she explained what she found not simply mistaken, but abhorrent about the views of such colleagues as Eyre and Hare. And this is text number 14. "There is no way, if one takes this line, that one can imagine oneself saying to a Nazi, 'But we're right and they're wrong,' with there being any substance to that judgment. Faced with the Nazis, who felt they had been justified in doing what they did, there would simply be a standoff. And I thought, morality just cannot be subjective in the way that, say, likes and dislikes are subjective. The separation of descriptions from attitudes or facts from values that characterize the current moral philosophy, current circa 1957, that separation had to be bad philosophy," unquote. Now, this is, of course, a retrospective characterization by someone who had by then purged herself of any taint of the old voluntarist, subjectivist line. But in the writings of the 50s and 60s, Foot too was briefly susceptible to its appeal. The lines that I quoted a few moments ago about the deception in the official line on morality appears in the final paragraph of a paper whose central thesis Foot would go on to repudiate. The paper is called Morality as a System of Hypothetical Imperatives. Why, she wonders in that paper, why do defenders of morality think it's so important to it that its authority be simultaneously rational, necessary, and categorical? Rational, that is, as opposed to sentimental, necessary, as opposed to merely contingent, and categorical, as opposed to hypothetical, conditional upon certain psychological facts about the basic aims, desires, purposes of particular agents. Why is it, she wondered there, that it's supposed to be the case that we all have reason to be moral as such, rather than particular reasons to do particular things in light of the interests of particular other people? So I'd like to read out to you the paper's rousing peroration, and this is text number 15. This conclusion, she says, this conclusion may appear dangerous and subversive of morality, we are apt to panic at the thought that we ourselves or other people might stop caring about the things we do care about. And we feel that the categorical imperative gives us some control over the situation. But it is interesting that the people of Leningrad were not struck by the thought that only the contingent fact that other citizens shared their loyalty and devotion to the city stood between them and the Germans during the terrible years of the siege. Perhaps we should be less troubled than we are by fear of defection from the moral cause. Perhaps we should even have less reason to fear it if people thought of themselves as volunteers banded together to fight for liberty and justice and against inhumanity and oppression. Volunteers is the image. Volunteers as opposed to the unstated other side of the metaphor, namely conscripts. So far, so voluntarist. There's nothing here for Hare or Sartre to object to. But there is in the phrasing of this peroration, there's another flavour as well, a concern with a different kind of freedom than the one that concerned the existentialists, both French and British. And this is the freedom that Iris Murdoch described in a radio broadcast from 1957. This is text number 16. Our freedom, says Murdoch, is not just a freedom to choose and act differently, it is also a freedom to think and believe differently, to see the world differently, to see the different configurations and describe them in different words. Moral differences can be differences of concept as well as differences of choice. A moral change shows in our vocabulary. How we see and describe the world is morals too. Now, Murdoch's most sustained treatment of this point, that a moral change shows in our vocabulary, is to be found in a 1962 lecture of hers, The Idea of Perfection. And her concern there is not the amoralist in his pure form, a sort of spectral personification of skepticism, designed precisely as the hardest of hard cases, impossible by design argumentatively to defeat, to refute, or to persuade. She's concerned with the amoralist within us all, the figure who is, as Williams put it, like most of us some of the time. Now, the description of the amoralist tendency in Murdoch could be cast as a point about the defects in his reasoning. But Murdoch preferred to conceive of what appalls us about that tendency, when it does appall us, as a defect in vision. In her justly famous example in that essay, a mother-in-law struggles with her middle-class contempt for her daughter-in-law, her temptation to see her as low, common, childish, and loud. Now, the mother-in-law is not in any strict philosophical sense an amoralist, but she exemplifies a particular disposition of which the philosopher's amoralist is only a generalized case. With the amoralist, the failure to take the interests of others into account in one's practical reasoning, this failure might be thought to lie downstream from a more basic failing, the failure to see other people as real and to see oneself as only one person among them. With the mother-in-law, what she initially fails to see is the reality of her daughter-in-law, rather than the projection of her various bourgeois anxieties. The mother-in-law manages, in Murdoch's schematic fiction here, to change her perceptions, coming to see her daughter-in-law rather as unaffected, guileless, and spontaneous, not vulgar or low or anything else. Assuming for the moment, as Murdoch invites us to assume, that there's something true or truer about these latter judgments, how might the mother-in-law have reached them? By argument? But what arguments might they have been? To quote Murdoch's words, and this is text number 17 on your handout, is not the metaphor of vision almost irresistibly suggested to anyone who, without philosophical prejudice, wishes to describe the situation? Is it not the natural metaphor? M, the mother-in-law, looks at D, the daughter-in-law. She attends to D. She focuses her attention. M is engaged in an internal struggle. She may, for instance, be tempted to enjoy caricatures of D in her imagination. And M's activity here, far from being something very odd and hazy, is something which, in a way, we find exceedingly familiar. Innumerable novels contain accounts of or what such struggles are like. Innumerable novels, including the one by Iris Murdoch that I mentioned as having read at the age of 17. And I shall take this opportunity to quote from it. This is The Bell, published in 57 or 58. And the plot of this book follows, among various other characters, these two people, Michael and Toby. Michael is a conflicted homosexual man, afflicted with guilt for his past and trying to rebuild his life through involvement in a lay Christian commune attached to a nunnery. Toby, on the other hand, is a teenaged innocent, spending his summer at Michael's commune before he goes to university. Now, after a wholesome evening together, where they drink a little local cider, Michael briefly loses his inhibitions and kisses Toby on an impulse incomprehensible even to him. The next chapters follow the two characters as they lie awake, alone, trying to understand what has just happened. And this is text number 18. Whereas previously Toby had regarded Michael as a paragon of virtue and had not dreamt of speculating about whether his life could contain blemishes or failures, he now attributed to him homosexuality to core, with all that it involved of the unnatural and the nameless. At least this was his first reaction. He found that his thought moved fast and in the direction of greater complexity. He began really to envisage Michael. What was it like to be Michael? What was Michael thinking now? Was he lying awake, miserable, wishing that hadn't happened? He was feeling, for the first time, intensely interested in Michael. He felt, too, as he conjured up the image of that obviously rather complicated person, a new emotion about him. He found himself feeling, towards Michael, curiously protective. Now, we could think of Toby as having argued himself into this new picture of the situation. But why think that? Why not adopt the picture that Murdoch suggests to us, that of vision, of coming to see, gradually, by degrees, something that was always there to be seen? Now, there are some reasons to want to turn this into the language of an argument, because to deny it, to speak in the somewhat hazy language of vision, can leave it mysterious what just happened. And it can leave it an open question to what extent, if at all, reason was involved in it. But it seems to me that no good is done by trying to impose some dogmatic theory of reason or logic or argument onto something that cries out for an open-ended examination. Now, to return to Philippa Foot, the voluntarism, as I've been calling it, of Foot's essay, at least its conclusion, is in one way indistinguishable from R.M. Hare's. In both cases, the limits of rational argument are not tragedies to be mourned, at second blush, if not at first. The limits of rational argument come out in both essays, both works, as emancipations and opportunities. But the mood, if I may use that word again, in Foot is so unlike that in Hare. Hare's voluntarism is above all lonely, as befits a philosophy arrived at in the loneliness of the prison camp. Foot's voluntarism, while it lasted, was social, and the freedom she prized was the freedom to see ourselves, to conceive of ourselves as social creatures, creatures whose obligations are obligations to our fellow creatures, not obligations to reason. Not me alone with my conscience, but us, to use her phrase, banded together. Why does it matter that these aims are, as one might say, merely contingent? Now, that question is a serious one. It's not a merely rhetorical question. I'm not begging the question simply in Foot's direction. And Foot herself would come to think that it did matter if it turned out that the character of these obligations was contingent and not categorical or necessary. On the voluntarist picture, Foot later came to think, if the fighters at Leningrad thought of themselves as in the right, to core, and not just by their own lights, there would be no substance to the statement, as she accused the positivists of saying. And the kind of conceptual freedom it relied on opened up other and possibly disturbing possibilities. Certainly we might conceive of ourselves as volunteered, banded together in the cause of liberty, but we might equally exercise that freedom to conceive of ourselves as outlaws fighting for injustice and unfreedom. The challenge for all subsequent moral philosophy has been precisely this. what grounds have we for hoping that people will not choose to conceive of themselves in those other ways? What distinguishes our hope from mere optimism, or worse, complacency? And this brings us back to the amoralist. Now, what may emerge from all of this is that the pure amoralist may well have the blessing of reason, if that means that as long as he's logically fleet of foot, his indifference to the claims of others will violate no norm of rationality. Reason, it turns out, may confer its blessings freely. But what also emerges is the narrowness of the logical space the amoralist must occupy. Just how tricky it is for an amoralist not to use any language, any concepts that might inadvertently betray some latent commitment to morality. So one couldn't, for instance, think of oneself as being brave in one's amoralism. Right? Even to entertain that kind of self-congratulatory thought would already make one precariously in the grip of a moral notion. So it's not easy to think consistently as an amoralist. Not impossible, but not easy either. So turn from a philosopher's fiction to a psychologically plausible embodied reality. The amoralist looks not so much like an alluring alternative to the moral life, but rather more like a psychopath, like someone who has absolutely no concern for the interests of any other human being. Right? And as with the psychopath, it seems we're not particularly disquieted by the thought that what the psychopath may need, right, if he acts out his indifference to the interests of others, we're not disquieted by the thought that what he needs is not argument, but the jail cell or the straitjacket. It may be, let us concede, that his reasons can't be any better than they are, he being who he is, but then ours can't be any worse than they are, we being who we are. So as Williams put it, some of the most interesting questions about the amoralist then lie not so much in what might be said to him in an attempt to persuade him, as in what might be said about him. And the audience for that is not the amoralist, but each other, those of us who are to some degree within the world of morality and to some degree, and some of the time, tempted out of it. So what emerges in Williams's words, which also summarizes in this one lapidary statement the thought that also informs the work of Foote and Murdoch in this period, that, and I quote, and this is text number 19 on your handout, "It is not the leap from the particular and effective to the rational and universal that makes all the difference. It is rather the step from the self to someone else." Now, the words that I've put in ellipses there are the words Kantian in the first bit of the sentence and Humean in the second. And in these words, I think we have another way in which that 18th century thought of the Scottish Enlightenment might be co-opted, not by the logical positivist as someone who's trying to paint this picture of a world bereft of value, bereft a result of the kind of cold light cast on it by science. It's not that view that we get from Hume as interpreted by the philosophers I've been discussing. The kind of Hume we get here is a spokesman for a humane world. Not a world without value, but a world full of value, but a value that exists not because it's simply out there as one more fact of nature, but a value that exists because and when, and only when, we value each other. Thank you very much.